So how are gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide transported once they are in the bloodstream? This module will examine that question. So let's begin with oxygen. So recall that oxygen is carried by the blood in two ways. The vast majority of it is carried by hemoglobin. So oxygen loosely binds to one part of the hemoglobin molecule, and it's carried within the molecule itself. A small proportion of it is dissolved in the plasma, and this is because oxygen does not dissolve very easily into liquids. So how does the erythrocyte, which contains hemoglobin, transport oxygen? So it's using this protein that we called hemoglobin, and if we ignore the water content of the erythrocyte, roughly 97% of the red blood cell is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, which is abbreviated HB, is a large molecule that is made up of 4 folded protein chains as well as some iron-containing molecules. So hemoglobin consists of 4 red-colored heme groups, and heme is a pigment and gives the erythrocyte its red color. Each heme has a single iron atom at its center. And it also contains 4 globin polypeptide chains. So each iron atom that is in the heme group can bind and carry a single oxygen molecule. So therefore, a single hemoglobin protein can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules in total. So as mentioned previously, each heme pigment molecule has a single iron atom at its center, and the iron atom is what binds and carries an oxygen molecule. So each iron atom can bind and carry a single oxygen, and therefore 4 oxygen molecules can be carried by a single hemoglobin protein because there are 4 heme groups in one hemoglobin. So oxyhemoglobin is the name that we give to hemoglobin when it has oxygen bound to it, while deoxyhemoglobin has no oxygen bound to it. So hemoglobin, it turns out, changes shape when oxygen is loaded or unloaded from it. The binding of oxygen tends to increase hemoglobin's affinity for subsequent oxygen molecules. So what this means is that when the first oxygen binds to a hemoglobin molecule, hemoglobin changes shape, and it is then easier for the second oxygen to bind to it. And each added oxygen makes it easier for the next one to bind, all the way up to 4. And we use the term fully saturated when all 4 heme groups are carrying oxygen. Several variables play a role in the saturation level of hemoglobin, that is, how well saturated it will be under a given set of conditions. So these factors usually favor loading of oxygen onto hemoglobin at the lungs and favor unloading of oxygen at the tissues where oxygen is needed. We see that the partial pressure of oxygen is the largest influence, but we will examine other influences like the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the temperature, the blood pH, as well as the concentration of a substance that's called Bpg. So these factors are also going to influence hemoglobin shape, particularly temperature, blood pH, and the partial pressures of CO2 as well as oxygen. So we'll start by examining this, which is an oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. It's a graph that describes the relationship of the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood plasma to the percent saturation of hemoglobin. Because recall that in order to get to the red blood cells, oxygen has to diffuse through blood plasma in order to get into the red blood cell and attach itself to hemoglobin. So this curve is also known as the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. So notice that as oxygen partial pressure increases, that is the variable on the horizontal axis here, so does the percent saturation of hemoglobin, which is on the vertical axis here, which generally it makes sense, right? So the more oxygen that we have, or the greater partial pressure of oxygen that we have, the higher percentage saturation that hemoglobin will be. But notice that the curve is shaped more like a flattened S shape rather than a straight line. The S shape of the curve is very physiologically important. So the shape of the curve tells us that hemoglobin will be mostly saturated, or at least very highly saturated, or partially highly saturated, when the partial pressure of oxygen is above 40 millimeters of mercury. and that hemoglobin will not be saturated at low partial pressures. So this means that hemoglobin is able to release its oxygens at the places in the body where the partial pressure of oxygen is low. So for example, at the tissues, which are using that oxygen to make energy. So we see that the partial pressure of oxygen is the largest influence on hemoglobin's ability to bind and release that oxygen. So the amount of oxygen carried by hemoglobin depends on the local concentration or the local partial pressure of oxygen. We see that if more oxygen is present, more of that oxygen is going to be bound to hemoglobin, and if less oxygen is present, we see less oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. Another way to look at it is this. If the local concentrations of oxygen are low, that is, there's a low partial pressure of oxygen at a particular tissue, so for example, in a tissue like a skeletal muscle that is active when we're exercising, the local concentration of oxygen will tend to be very low, and hemoglobin will tend to release the oxygen that it is carrying so that that oxygen can be available for that tissue to use. So if local oxygen concentrations are high, then hemoglobin will tend to hang on to the oxygen that it is carrying. So let's look at an example of this at high altitudes, or I should just say in general at altitude. So at sea level, there is a high partial pressure of oxygen, which means that more oxygen will diffuse into the blood and more of that will bind to hemoglobin. And as a result, hemoglobin will be very highly saturated. But now let's go up in elevation. Even if the partial pressure of oxygen were to drop to 80 millimeters of mercury, following that up to the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve, we see that hemoglobin will still be very highly saturated. So at sea level, hemoglobin might be about 98% saturated, but at elevation, hemoglobin might still be very highly saturated at 95%. So we see that a fairly large decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen in the environment, that is in the air that we're breathing, does not necessarily lead to a substantial decrease in saturation of hemoglobin. And that's thanks to the flattened S-shape curve of the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. So even at relatively high altitudes, a big drop in the partial pressure of oxygen only causes a small change in the hemoglobin oxygen saturation. This is because the top of the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve is almost flat. So one complaint that I have with this diagram is the wording that it uses. At sea level, is there really more oxygen? And the answer to that question is no, there isn't more oxygen at sea level. So recall that the Earth's atmosphere is composed of 20.9% oxygen, regardless of whether you're standing on the beach or standing on the summit of Mount Everest. What is different as we go up in altitude is the atmospheric pressure. And as we increase in altitude, we see a decrease in atmospheric pressure and a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen that follows that. So meanwhile, the left side of the curve tells us something completely different. So at low partial pressure of oxygen, large changes in local PO2, that is local partial pressures of oxygen, cause large changes in hemoglobin saturation. So when local partial pressures of oxygen are low, hemoglobin more easily releases the oxygen that it is carrying. This is helpful for unloading oxygen at tissues and muscles during exercise because these tissues have relatively low oxygen concentrations when activity is taking place. So this means that the blood going to these tissues will more easily release its oxygen because that's where it is needed. And this is ensuring that oxygen is delivered to places where it's needed most, like skeletal muscles when they're undergoing exercise. So now let's examine the influence of temperature. So we see that increases in temperature shift the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve to the right, and decreases in temperature shift the curve to the left. So a shift to the right means that hemoglobin will more easily unload the oxygen that it is carrying, whereas a shift to the left means that hemoglobin will less easily release its oxygen. Now, a shift to the right is physiologically important because as we exercise, our body temperature does go up a little bit, and so that means that a shift to the right of the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve will mean that hemoglobin is more easily releasing its oxygen under conditions in which we are exercising. So that's going to make that oxygen more available to the tissues that are using it during exercise. So what about the influence of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the influence of pH? So we see that increases in carbon dioxide or a decrease in pH, that is the pH becoming more acidic, will shift the curve to the right. So meaning that as CO2 increases or as pH decreases, hemoglobin will more easily release its oxygen. Again, we have conditions of high CO2 concentrations and low pH in the tissues when we are exercising. So once again, we see that curve shifting to the right so that hemoglobin is more easily going to be releasing its oxygen when we are exercising and undergoing more activity. On the other hand, we see that decreases in carbon dioxide concentration or increases in pH, that is, if the tissues become more alkaline, we see that the curve shifts to the left, which is going to be represented by the blue line there, meaning that as carbon dioxide decreases or pH increases, hemoglobin will less easily release its bound oxygen. So of the factors that we have investigated, we see that the partial pressure of oxygen is the largest influence on the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, or the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. So lastly, let's take a look at Bpg concentrations. So Bpg, which stands for bisphosphoglycerate, is a substance that is made by red blood cells during glycolysis. And we see that glycolysis is the primary source of ATP energy when oxygen concentrations in that particular cell are low. So we see that increases in Bpg shifts the curve to the right, which means that oxygen is more easily unloaded. Again, we also see high Bpg concentrations when we are exercising because local drops in oxygen concentration will force some cells, like skeletal muscles, to rely on glycolysis to make ATP. And so we see that that the concentrations of Bpg will go up when we are exercising, and therefore that will cause hemoglobin to more easily release its oxygen so that it can be available for the body to use. So we see that an effect called the Bohr Effect is the term that describes the phenomenon of the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve shifting to the right when CO2 concentrations increase, when tissues become more acidic, or when the concentration of Bpg increases. So this shift of the curve to the right means that oxygen will again be more easily released from hemoglobin at the tissues where it's needed the most. So the Bohr effect is not to be confused with the Bohr effect. So I know physiology is not exactly everyone's favorite subject, but here we've kind of highlighted some very important aspects of the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. So where do we see all of these conditions or all of these factors like temperature, blood pH, or I should say increased acidity in the tissues, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and the concentration of Bpg, where are these all the highest in the body? It turns out that these are all the highest in the systemic arteries that are serving tissues, particularly the tissues like skeletal muscles that are highly active when we are exercising. So we see that tissues use oxygen and glucose to make ATP. They release CO2 as a byproduct of that, which increases the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or the PCO2, in that part of the body. These factors all weaken the hemoglobin-oxygen bond, and therefore hemoglobin more easily releases its oxygen at the tissues. And this is what we were describing with the Bohr effect. This is the shifting of the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve to the right. We also see that the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve for fetal hemoglobin is shifted to the left, the blue line, compared to adult, which is the red line, showing that fetal hemoglobin has a stronger affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin does. Because anytime the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve is shifted to the left, that means that hemoglobin will more strongly hold on to its oxygen. Anytime we shift the curve to the right, that weakens the oxygen hemoglobin bond, and hemoglobin will more easily release its oxygen. So we see that fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin does. So this property of fetal hemoglobin ensures that fetal hemoglobin is always going to be more saturated than mother's hemoglobin at a given partial pressure of oxygen. It also ensures that oxygen will always diffuse from maternal hemoglobin to fetal hemoglobin. And finally, a few terms before we finish this segment here. So hypoxia is the term for low oxygen in the body, while hypoxemia refers specifically to low blood oxygen content. Anemic hypoxia is a specific type of hypoxia caused by low numbers of red blood cells, low hemoglobin concentrations, or some combination of both. Ischemic hypoxia refers to hypoxia that results from reduced blood flow to specific tissues. So ischemia specifically referring to reduced blood flow to certain parts of the body. So we see that the oxygen content of the blood itself may be high, but if blood flow to a specific area is very low, so for instance due to a blockage, then that will create hypoxia, or we call it ischemic hypoxia, in that specific area. We also have histotoxic hypoxia, which refers to low oxygen use by the mitochondria. And recall that earlier that the mitochondria are the organelles that use glucose and they use oxygen in order to make ATP. So certain types of poisons, like cyanide, interfere with the mitochondria's ability to create ATP and can result in histotoxic hypoxia.